Hello and welcome to another episode of Exchanges. This week on the program, Chris Richardson, a man that needs no introduction, one of Australia's preeminent economists out there. We go through an absolute plethora of things that are affecting the globe, the nation, and you as the person out there. So without any further ado, here's Chris Richardson and this week's episode of Exchanges. Chris Richardson, I want to ask you a bit of a strange random question to start with. What's keeping you up at night?
Stuff.
Right?
So it's geopolitics, basically. Yeah. We are now living in a more volatile and hence more dangerous time than the world has seen in decades. There are a bunch of similarities with earlier decades, the 20s, the 30s, last century. And there are now large nations who are controlled by old men with big agendas, right? You know, who want to...
Big agendas or big egos?
And it's the same thing, right?
Yeah,
you
true.
know, and they don't, whether it's Russia or China, maybe even arguably including the US, what the leaders want isn't necessarily what is good for the population of those nations. And economists always focus on the incentives, right? And when the incentives are wrong, when the leaders aren't responding to national interest but their own interest, you get bad decisions. And in our more complicated, more interconnected world, it is very much geopolitics that worries me.
Yeah, so that's why I knew that sort of watching what you've been putting on LinkedIn, watching what you do in the public and in the personal eye, I knew that's what was going through your head. And so it brings back to little old us. I mean, again, I've been asked this question myself is, where does Australia fit into this? And I said, unfortunately, we are a following nation. We are a small nation that sort of plays bigger than we probably should in terms of a nation with only 27 million people. So we now know that we are going to go through trade war 2.0. We are going to go through possibly, unlike, trade war 2.1, we will get taxed with regards to steel and aluminium imports. My next question for you is, your big thing at the moment is that the RBA may deal itself out in terms of what happens with exactly what you said, incentives for the wrong reasons. So the question in the exchange I want to have now is, let's say the RBA cut on February 18 when we're doing this record before, and they trade themselves out, because then they will sort of say, look, we're getting back towards sustainably into target, probably not completely there yet. I would argue that there are things like sticky inflation still a bit of a concern, but overall, they're going to be slow and steady wins the race, and would argue that probably July might be the next one at the earliest if they were to do it. So what's that next step from the policy side that you're really concerned about after what we've just seen overseas in geopolitics in your answer, but also where the blurred purple, I think is the way to say it to you, with your red and your blues, is going forward with the money that they're clearly going to give back to the electorate, because the electorate's worked out it can get itself paid on how it votes.
Yeah, and that worries me. And again, it's all about the incentives. Economists are always going to focus on the incentives. It's not one side of politics or the other. They're all the same. I get frustrated with the people who think one side are magnificent heroes and the other side are complete disasters. If that's your sole view in life, then you are a deep disappointment to your primary school maths teacher. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
There are a series of guardrails that stop the politicians, the ones in government, the ones in opposition, being too silly, pushing too hard on stuff. The Reserve Bank acts as a guardrail. Don't throw too much money around or we'll get inflation and interest rates will have to go up. PFO.
Do you see that happening? That's the question. Do you see that possibly happening?
Well, what worries me in the next little while is regardless of what the Reserve Bank does on February the 18th, I think that after February 18th and before the election, politicians are going to be sure that rates aren't going to go down or up. Basically, it's February 18 or it's after the election. And under those circumstances, we've recently had those Victorian state by-elections that suggested that the federal election will be decided in the outer suburban seats in Melbourne and in Sydney. And of course, we've had in recent years both parties, usually in a bipartisan fashion, throwing enormous amounts of poorly targeted money at Western Australia and at Queensland, because that's where they thought that the election was going to be decided. Well, now Reserve Bank out of the game. Both sides of politics think, oh, well, hang on, we've got to make a sprint for the outer suburban marginals in the biggest capital cities, and new money gets thrown into the mix. And that does worry me. The underlying equation of inflation is too much money chasing too little stuff, demand greater than supply. And there's a risk that the politicians, as they grab for power in the federal election, don't have either the Reserve Bank as a guardrail or the pre-election fiscal outlook. Treasury and Finance have this opportunity to tell truth during an election campaign, and they never take it. They'll tell you the numbers, but they won't really tell you their view on what's going on. Or you look at something like the Parliamentary Budget Office, it's magnificent, but again, both sides game it around what policies are put into the PBO and when they're put in. All of those things say that politicians have a bunch of loopholes in and around the guardrails that are meant to keep them on their best behaviour. And it is the wider Australian public that is the victim.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to come back to two things there, because clearly what you were talking about there, the word that we were speaking about off air is mediocre, and you're getting mediocre policy. But I want to come back to the other thing that I keep getting asked about. I know you get asked about it all the time, which is the whole concept that politicians have basically put and hung their hat on the one policy they can't change, being monetary policy. The Howard government probably started that whole concept. But why do they see that as the only option going forward? Is that if we do X, it will get inflation to Y, and therefore the RBA is going to do what we want it to do, which is to show that we can economically manage and get your home loan lower. Why is that now the direction that we are in? Because it's clearly led to a behaviour from the consumer, from the electorate, and from particularly the Australian public. I mean, this is an Australian issue, but when did that become the norm, and why has that therefore led to your word, the mediocrity that we now have in policy?
So for the government, the fastest shift you can have in living standards between now and the election is the Reserve Bank doing something. The other key things that can shift living standards are usually slower moving. So it's worth stepping back and putting this really big context. So, a couple of years ago, here and around the world, inflation takes off for the first time in decades, and our Reserve Bank and the other central banks around the world, they say, well, previously when we fought inflation, we made mistakes, we've gone too hard, unemployment's gone up a lot, we don't want to do that. We're going to be careful as we raise rates, as we fight inflation to not see unemployment go up to the extent that it's done in past inflation fights. And so that's what we've had. And Australia in particular has been one of the more careful ones. But when you go more carefully and more slowly in the fight against inflation, and there are good reasons for that, but it shifts the pain. What you actually end up doing is the pain shows up elsewhere. You have a longer period in which wages stay behind prices. Prices sprint, wages gradually catch up. But if inflation keeps going in a slow fight, then that problem hangs around for longer. If you have, and Australia has, our families have enormous debts. So that period of higher interest rates, if it's a longer period, again, you get, pain hanging around. And our tax system here in Australia is geared to inflation. Inflation takes money from families, gives it to businesses and the tax man. So as we quite successfully, minimise the damage to unemployment, what we've done is shifted more pain than you've seen in the past onto wages, right? For wage earners, that it doesn't go as far, onto borrowers and onto taxpayers, and that's a lot of grumpy people. And even if the economics are good, the politics of many bald people feeling pain for a long time is terrible.
So that, because I want to go on to that, because one of the things that I get my bee in the bonnet about is the tax mix. The fact that we have such a high reliance on personal income tax, and the government is forecasting that in the next, basically 26 and 27, the tax mix could be as much as 62% in personal income tax. I've asked previous guests this as well. Is that because we just do not have the confidence as politicians to actually reform the tax policy that needs to happen, that tax mix that needs to change, that pain that you're alluding to? I mean, we all forget 2010, Ken Henry's tax review was completely reposing this whole concept of changing it. At what point does that grumpy person wake the politician up that the policy that could really move the dial long term is changing that mix and getting away from having personal income tax being basically the bedrock of government spending and the bedrock of government revenue? What is it that's going to trigger that?
Yeah, and the pain of that, basically, when you rely too much on one tax and not enough on other taxes, that's a mistake, right? And Australia's...
That's my argument too, right? It's too heavily. I mean, if you're an asset manager and you saw 60% of your revenue coming from one stream, surely you'd try and act and fix that up, surely.
So worth making a point that most people don't necessarily think of, right? So if you think of government as having two big levers, spending and taxes, and two big aims, prosperity, our living standards, the size of the pie, as it were, and how the pie is sliced up, fairness, right? So prosperity and fairness. And you say, well, we've got these two big levers, what's important for what? And at a very simple level, people tend to forget that if you're trying to improve fairness in Australia, that's mostly a spending question. You look at the income of the bottom 20% of Australians, right? They get their income from government spending. They get unemployment benefits, they get student benefits, they get a pension, they get rent assistance, they get whatever else. In fact, if you're on minimum income in Australia, you're spread fairly evenly through the family income set in this nation. So spending is our main weapon to achieve fairness. Taxes, that's much more a prosperity story. There are some taxes, when you raise $1, the economy shrinks by almost $1 because the tax is so bad. Your classic example is state government stamp duties. They hold this big red stop sign and said, no, don't move from where you are because we'll charge you a fortune, even if it's no longer appropriate for the kids, even if it's no longer appropriate for your job or your lifestyle or whatever it may be. Other types of taxes, and funnily enough, it's another state property tax, land tax, don't have such a big impact in shrinking the economy. And remembering those levers, and to be clear, tax is far from the only prosperity lever. You could do all sorts of things in Australia that would make us more prosperous. But tax is a great example. Some of the smartest things we could do in tax are political poison. They are absolutely toxic. My basic conclusion as I look at the last quarter of a century of politics in Australia is that it's getting easier and easier to become Prime Minister and harder to do something with it once you get there.
Yeah, and I can hear what you're saying, those two toxic things I'm going to now bring you up on, which is GST. Is going to be probably one of those things that we need to talk about. The other one is one of my things that I argue about is super. I mean, superannuation and the way that super, I think the policy and the concept of it was absolutely fantastic. The behavior it's created has been fascinating because, again, one day you go from accumulation to pension phase and you're told to click your fingers and start spending it. But we are one of the only nations that doesn't tax pension phase. Firstly, GST. How the hell do the feds get out of the GST WA deal? Because clearly that is part of the equation. And then, as you said, the toxic part of it is saying we need to move it to 15%. Can you make the argument? Can you pitch it to actually have that change?
Oh, yeah. So just that first one, the WA GST deal is the feds get a bunch of money and GST happens to be the bucket That is the main way we then hand money back to the states. But handing money back to the states depends on how much they need, and how much they need depends on a bunch of things. And if you can imagine a state like Western Australia, which is blessed with minerals, the iron ore and a bunch of others,
and geographically the largest state in the country as well.
There are times when those mineral prices are sky high. They have royalties on them. They earn $1 bazillion on that, and that's great. But when you're deciding what's fair to go out of Canberra to a bunch of states, you should take account of that. Trouble is, that money really bounces up and down, and not that long ago in Western Australia, it was getting because the resources, in particular the iron ore money royalties, have been so good that the system was giving them only a fairly small amount of GST. They weren't worse off, right? They were just getting the money in different ways, even though a bit of a lag in the system made it harder. But the politics became tricky. Western Australia was increasingly central to federal elections. Other than a coalition government said, well, we'll make sure you get at least a given amount. Used to be 70 cents, now 75 cents in the dollar. Here we are at the top of yet another stunning mineral boom. The world has never given Australia a pay rise like we've had until the one in recent years. And so Western Australia is again earning $1 bazillion in these royalties, but it gets the extra, the minimum, but that is extra overall compared to its needs out of the GST. That's about $6 billion a year at the moment, from which the average Australian gets the rough equivalent they would get from getting a bunch of $100 notes, rolling them up carefully, and then smoking them.
So how do you get out of it?
Well, it might have begun under the last government. The current government extended it, and the current Prime Minister, went to Perth. He was pressed about it by a journalist. He grabbed the arm of the journalist and inked into his arm a promise
not to touch it.
There would be no change to this deal. Now, the average Australian doesn't. We're not aware of this deal. We aren't aware of how spectacularly stupid it is. And again, the reason is not because WA was being stiffed. In fact, you can look, they just updated their, ahead of the election, their estimate of their finances. Again, it looks ever better. It happened because Western Australia has been very central to the last couple of federal elections, which is why both sides are saying, well, this and that, or Future Made in Australia wants to throw a bunch of extra money at Western Australia. All sorts of things get done, not because it's a good idea, but because, it's seen as good politics.
Yeah, mediocrity. So the next part of that question that I also want to sort of go on further for is superannuation. It's a discussion point that in our industry we have a lot, and how super is being used. We have seen, it managed to get through the Banking Royal Commission without probably being part of that discussion. Is there policy inside super that you would like to sort of see to be implemented? Because again, you're talking about incentives, you're talking about how you find the money, you're talking about how we drive our economy better with the funds that we have. I mean, compulsory super is there. I mean, we're seeing possibly with the Future Fund that the government's now sort of saying that they want to put it into green industries, etc. All that kind of thing. Is that also where we now need to be discussing going forward, that we need to be more self-reliant on the funds that we generate ourselves for the investment that we need to actually drive our economy forward? Because tax is one question. It's about the prosperity, as you said before, and finding the capital, and capital overseas has obviously got its other concerns right now. So is this the next discussion that we need to start having, is super and super investment?
Oh, for sure. We've needed it for a very long time. I was part of a recommendation that went into the Henry tax review saying how we could do super better. Before I said, if you're looking to improve fairness, you're basically looking at spending. If you're looking to improve prosperity, our living standards, you're basically looking at tax. Superannuation is an extension. Superannuation is effectively a tax discussion, but we've done it so spectacularly badly that we have screwed up fairness. So what happens is if you take a dollar out of the income system and income taxes and put it into the superannuation system, you take it out of personal tax, which is higher when you've got a high income, into super, which used to be a flat tax. It's now a flat tax plus some sticky tape.
Yeah.
And that says if you have a higher income and you get some money into super, you get a bigger tax break per dollar as a high income person than a low income person. And of course, you've got many more dollars, and then it's in the system and we treat it more generously again, partly due to the interaction of a bunch of the way we, a bunch of different types of tax treatment of different questions. Then, as you say, in retirement, we are generous again. The end result is that the superannuation system is a vast engine that, if you look at it over time, takes money from poorer Australians and gives it to richer Australians. We have gone way over the top. You need to repair it in a bunch of ways, all of which are unlikely to happen. Some of the recent discussion has been the sort of after the event. All right, well, you're now retired, you want your money, and it's made the excellent point that we should maybe be looking at the equivalent of having more pensions and less remaining in super, or in other words, one way or another, you get more of an ongoing income and less of this lump sum. I would merely put that slightly differently. We have a system which should have better pensions, government pensions, including the ability in retirement to buy more government pension from the government. I'm going to give the government money; it'll give me a pension in the years to come, and less on lump sums.
Yeah, I'm a little bit different on that. I'm actually of the view that pension phase needs to be looked at from an earnings perspective the same way that personal income tax is. Now, obviously not on the same structure, but if you're in pension phase and you're earning $100,000 in dividends and returns, basically the streams that you get, and that's all tax-free, but you also then get all the added benefits of things like Medicare and what have you. That is where I'm sort of now arguing that if you look at the generations below that are looking up and looking at how much pressure is coming into the system and all the discussion we've just had about, personal income tax and taking, from the have-nots to the haves, that has to be part of the debate. Now, I know when I say this out loud, I've been, accosted by people saying, how dare you talk about taking my franking credits away inside my super pension phase, or how dare you think about taxing the income that I've worked so hard to get to. This is from, the behavioral economic side that I come to, that I get to. But you're right. My concern is we can't have that debate. We can't actually talk about how that change would happen in terms of changing the super system. So you talk about the prosperity, and coming back to that prosperity thing, the next question that comes is, in the next half century, we're probably going to have to stop digging holes like we do. We're probably going to have to find ways to make the services that we offer more competitive. What is the next levers that have to happen to drive Australia from being basically considered lucky, which we will always continue to be because of where we are geographically, but actually showing that we can produce something outside of minerals, outside of getting lucky in banking? Where is that, and what do you see needs to be done to promote that? Because Future Made in Australia is picking winners against players that are going to beat us anyway. What's your view on that?
It's interesting that in the world of economics, the word lucky for an economy is actually a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
We have this concept of a resources curse. Some nations that are lucky enough to have whatever it may be, oil or, and we have a whole bunch of different things. But the world wants our rocks and pays us good money for them one way or another. And the resources curse is the way that gets badly managed by the nations who do, have the luck of those resources. And I look in particular at the last 20 years in Australia, the 20 years across which China industrialized at a stunning pace and did so in a manner that grabbed all sorts of commodities. It was incredibly rapid industrialization, massive amounts of building, and arguably a lot of overbuilding. But it meant that the world gave Australia a pay rise. I mentioned that that's been at its biggest in the last couple of years, but this has been going on for so long that Australians don't realise that the main description of our last 20 years is that it hasn't been as hard as it used to be to raise Australian living standards. A bunch of stuff got handed to us on a platter. We've had it much easier than elsewhere. I was recently reading a couple of biographies, one of Paul Keating, one of David Morgan, who was my first boss in Federal Treasury and went on to be a Deputy Secretary in Treasury. And the decisions that, I was part of it at the time, but I was more junior. Just how hard all those decisions were. And so, you ask, well, for the Australia of 50 years in the future to enjoy not just greater prosperity than today, but the relative prosperity compared to other nations, we're going to need a lot more courage than we have seen displayed here in this nation for a long time from our politicians. Everybody around the world, one way or another, will be able to surf on the new technologies like AI or the, better education or whatever it may be. The nations that do better still than that, they need their political systems to generate the occasional hard decision to challenge the population and say, well, you're not going to like this to begin with, but it's the smart play. And that, I think, when I said it's getting easier and easier to become Prime Minister and harder and harder to do something with it, we have headed in the opposite direction. Our ability as a nation to do the tough thing because of the long-term benefit, that's almost disappeared.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the cycle, the 3 years that they have, I mean, at the moment, if you look, incumbency around the world is toxic, and that's why this coming election, you and I are speaking in February of 2025, that clearly that will be the core focus, but that's never changed. I think that's what's also forgotten, is that in the end, the household thinks about the household, and there hasn't really been a change in that concept over the last sort of, particularly I agree with you, the last 20 years. And so the hurt and the pain that I think you're pointing to, that, what is the floating Aussie dollar of the Hawke era, or what is the superannuation period of the Keating era, or what is the GST era of the Howard era in terms of reforms that have happened? Infrastructure spending is the last part of my question for you for today with regards to Howie. Is it that they need, governments clearly love throwing money at the electorate, and they have clearly gone down the infrastructure spending point. It's, again, what they've spent it on. Do we need to actually be, big enough to admit that we need to look at players like Singapore, or we need to look at players like, India, that are going, okay, let's build the hub. Let's build a hub of X, and it will be in X area, and we will build the hospitals, the schools, and the industrial parks, not just the train, not just the road. Is that where we are missing the point, that if we're going to do these big builds, as Victoria loves to call it where I live, or the big infrastructure spending that's gone up in Queensland around Gladstone and Townsville, that is where the future can actually be had, and therefore it will put pain on a Melbourne and a Sydney, because it will attract talent out of the cities. Is that where we need to be sort of streaming further into the future going forward?
If the costs and benefits add up, and part of the problem is the stuff that we do in Australia tends to be because the politics is good rather than because the economics is good. And that is incredibly frustrating. We are not setting enough aside as investment and infrastructure for the future. And what we are doing is not good quality. And once it's there, we don't price it right. Congestion charging in the middle of our cities, the sort of peak pricing around, February afternoons, and the kids come home from school and turn on the air conditioning and the like. I would actually suggest that the largest single bit of infrastructure in Australia by far is the largest single reform that I would like to see. And it's also incredibly difficult to achieve. We have over $11 trillion of Australian wealth in our housing. And some people think you can just wave a magic wand and change negative gearing or something, and you could fix that. Well, we'd had a big test in the last 2.5 years around two competing theories of what's wrong in housing. We have seen interest rates go up a lot. And one thought, and it used to be my thought, was that there would be a quite significant impact on Australian housing prices as interest rates went up. Now, it has been painful for prices, but what we know is that the other main competing theory that we just haven't said yes enough, yes in my backyard enough around housing is part of the problem. And I look where so for example, what we've seen with those Reserve Bank interest rates increases have been the equivalent of abolishing negative gearing 25 times over. I mean, both interest rates and negative gearing affect the cost of the money that is going into housing. All right? We know that stuff's important, but I think the make or break around housing is getting older and richer Australians to say yes to more stuff in their backyard. That is something that we have been terrible at. And to be a NIMBY is a marvelous self-sealed system. You think you're doing a marvelous thing by your local neighborhood, and while you stop everything around you, that also makes your own housing price go up. So you become richer as a result. So you feel good about yourself and you become better off. But we have, to your point around income tax and what we're doing to younger Australians, I would also add housing, right? So housing, as we've done it in Australia, is a machine that takes money from poor people and gives it to rich people. Superannuation, as we do it in Australia, is a machine that takes money from poor people and gives it to rich people. And both of those are now, I would say, creaking dangerously.
So the final question that I ask all of my guests, Chris Richardson, is if you were in charge for one day, what would you change? What would you do?
I would try to change the incentives that our politicians face. It's not that one side is better than the other, one side are geniuses, the other side aren't. We need to give them better incentives so they'll make better decisions, and you can do that in some ways. I talked about the various institutions that can help our governance, the Reserve Bank, where we have made some recent changes. This PFO, pre-election fiscal outlook, we need to change the rules so that Treasury and Finance do, take their one chance when there's not one side in power or the other. It's just a caretaker government to speak up. We need to give Parliamentary Budget Office much better a chance to speak up. We need the Productivity Commission, instead of trying to get rid of it, as some politicians do on a regular basis. You need to allow it to choose some of its own topics to look at. You need something as simple as media releases from federal government ministers saying we've done this and talking about big dollars to actually put down the bottom of that media release the change in dollars that Cabinet has ticked off on, the little numbers instead of the big numbers they've pretended up in the release. We need to be telling the truth to ourselves much more often. That will, it'll make our politicians make better choices.
That is a brilliant answer and a brilliant way to finish. Chris Richardson, thank you so much for joining Exchanges.
Many thanks, Evan.
What a brilliant episode, and I'm really, really glad that Chris was on there explaining very clearly his issues that he sees, particularly around the prosperity and also the haves and the have-not scenarios going forward. I really hope you liked that episode. Before I go any further, as always, please remember that if you do have any questions for us here at Exchanges, the email is exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. And don't forget, down below, please subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the better and bigger guests that we can get, and the more we continue to expand. But until next week, I'm Evan Lucas, and thanks for joining Exchanges.